Welcome to the Civil War Center podcast. Learn about the battles, events, and people that shaped the turning point in American history. I'm your host, Andy Lucian. Hello, everyone. Today we are joined by Dr. David J. Kent. David J. Kent is an award-winning scientist, a respected Abraham Lincoln historian, and a successful multi-book author. His newest book, Lincoln, the Fire of Genius, which we will discuss in this episode, was released on September 1st of 2022. He has 35 years of experience in scientific research, consulting, writing, and a lifetime of Lincoln studies. He's also currently the president of the Lincoln Group of D.C., the treasurer and member of the executive committee and board of directors of the Abraham Lincoln Institute, and is a member of the Lincoln Forum Board of Advisors. He has previously served as president of 3 different scientific organizations. Today, David J. Kent sits down with us to discuss his new book and to talk about Lincoln, his life, his love of science, and the scientific advancements he made during his time as president. I hope you enjoy this discussion. Today, we are joined by author David J. Kent. How are you today, sir?
I am good. How are you?
I'm great. Looking forward to this discussion. So today we will be discussing your upcoming book, Lincoln, the Fire of Genius, which takes a look at his scientific prowess, his patent. He's the only president with a patent. Is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah, so we'll be taking a look at that. But before we dive into all that, because I'm excited to talk about your book, I want to know a bit about you, and I'm sure our listeners do as well. So tell us a bit about yourself. How long have you been writing and studying Lincoln?
Well, I've been studying Lincoln probably my whole life, but it's more complicated than that. As you might guess, because I'm writing about science, and Lincoln's interest in science and technology is that I have a science background as well. And part of that is because I grew up in a small town in Massachusetts that billed itself as the birthplace of American independence. And there's a long story behind that. And obviously there was a lot of history in the town, and mostly about the Revolutionary War. So I kind of stood out because I was interested in Lincoln and Civil War, and everybody else in town was less interested in the Revolutionary War because that was more relevant to Massachusetts. But at the same time, it's a coastal town and had great beaches and square miles of marshes, salt marshes and forest. And at the time when I was growing up, Jacques Cousteau was big on television. He's a big oceanographer and doing all these programs. So I kind of gravitated to both science and history and ended up as a paying career in science. So I actually worked as a marine biologist for a while until somebody burned down my laboratory. And then I worked in consulting and regulatory science and got my degrees, my college degrees and advanced degrees were all in science. But at the same time, I was always studying Lincoln behind the scenes and collecting books. And you can see part of my book collection.
It's impressive.
Those are all Lincoln books. And now I have about 1,600 Lincoln books. So that's only about a third of what I have.
Wow.
And I've read not all of them, obviously, but I've read a good number of them. And then, so I was in sciences, and I spent some time in Europe doing regulatory science. And then I came back after 3 years there. I came back and decided, I'm getting tired of doing science and working as a consultant. I really want to pursue more of the Abraham Lincoln Civil War side. So I actually quit my job in the consulting, and I signed up with the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia, which is an organization here in the Washington, D.C. area that studies Lincoln and invites guest speakers to talk about Lincoln. And so that was about 10 years ago. I started with the Lincoln Group. And soon after that, I quit the job and I focused on writing. So before that, all of my writing had been scientific papers and scientific reports. And, it was getting kind of boring, to be honest. And, and I wanted to reach out. So I went 10 years ago, actually, I went and pitched an early concept for this book at a writing conference, and didn't actually get a contract to write this book until much later, but did end up writing books on Nikola Tesla, on Thomas Edison, and then a book on Abraham Lincoln. All very general biographies with a lot of pictures. That really was good for. It was good for everybody, but because of all of the pictures, all the graphics, it appealed more than I expected to younger generations who were much more graphic centric than older generations. So those all did very well. But all the while I was thinking about this book. And I'll get to that in a little bit. But in any case, I quit. I was now writing full time. I was become part of the board of the Lincoln Group of DC, and I'm now the president of the Lincoln Group of DC. I'm also on the executive committee of the Abraham Lincoln Institute and on the advisory board for the Lincoln Forum, and involved in some other Lincoln groups. So I pretty much put the science behind me and got totally into Lincoln and the Civil War time period. And then, of course, like the picture behind you with the cannons, I live in Northern Virginia, maybe a 5-minute walk from one of the smaller battlefields, the Ox Hill battlefield. Mm-hmm. And I'm not very far from Manassas, and there are a lot of Civil War battlefields around here, so it's hard to ignore the Civil War when you live in this area.
I can imagine. So you have a bit of a different perspective on history, because you're not coming at history from that, I've been studying history my whole life. You kind of have a fresh perspective.
Yeah, I think that makes a difference. All of us have biases, and from our upbringing and what we study in school, and obviously I have a science bias because of that. But I've also been, because I grew up in an area that was so steeped in history, and now I've lived for the last 30 years in a place that is steeped in history. And I've always been interested in history, so I kind of carry the both. And I think that's what gave me a perspective that allowed me to see this thread of science and technology through Lincoln's life that others maybe didn't see. Yeah, they maybe knew he had a patent, but other than that, maybe not so much. Right. Didn't think about it too much. So.
And what about Lincoln draws you specifically to him? And is it the Civil War as a whole that fascinates you? It sounds like it was, or is it Lincoln specifically?
I'm more of a Lincoln person than a Civil War person.
Okay.
Obviously, you can't talk about Lincoln without talking about the Civil War. But I am interested in Lincoln's whole life and his upbringing. In a way, it was strange. I'm not sure how I got into Lincoln because, as I said, my time was very much a Revolutionary War era focus. Mm-hmm. And I was kind of always an oddball in school, and I had to do something different. But I think with Lincoln, Lincoln was somebody who he had integrity, he had honesty, and he had a general desire to not only better his condition, but better everyone's condition, that give everybody, as he says later, give everybody an equal chance in the race of life. Mm-hmm. And he grew up very poor on the frontier and as a farmer, and a lot of self-taught. I grew up in a very blue collar family, and went to college, but went to college on loans and grants, and really felt like I had to work to keep ahead, keep ahead of people who had more advantages. So I guess maybe that was some of the reason why I felt a kinship with Lincoln. Obviously not because he was born in Kentucky and lived in Indiana and Illinois, because I grew up in Massachusetts. I'm a Northerner. But he did interest me early on, and so he was the main reason why I got into this time period of study, and then by extension, of course, the Civil War time period, but also everything that led up to that in Lincoln's time.
Yeah, they're definitely inseparable, right? You can't have Lincoln without the Civil War. So your upcoming book, let's talk a bit about that. Lincoln, the Fire of Genius. So what is this book about for the listeners, and what can they expect when they pick up a copy?
Well, it's basically a book. It does go through Lincoln's life, starting as a young farm boy on the frontier, with basically a subsistence farm, without much money, with just basically getting by, and then works through his life. Obviously, became a shopkeeper, and then he's a lawyer, and he's a politician, and eventually a president during the Civil War. So I looked at that time period, and as I looked closer and closer, I started seeing more science and technology threaded through that life. So I wanted to carry that thread through his entire life, starting at the beginning and then getting up to, basically, I guess you could say there's three parts. There's 5 sections of the book, each with several chapters, but there's really 3 parts in the sense that, I look at Lincoln, how he gained some of this knowledge, and where did this idea of him being interested in science and technology came from. And then the middle period is when he's working as a lawyer and as a politician. So how did he apply that? How did that come out in what he was doing on a daily basis in his jobs? And then finally, obviously, the Civil War. The last 4 chapters are focused entirely on the Civil War and looking at things like the technology of war, the science of war. I even look at the assassination and look at aspects of the medical parts of that. But also the institutionalizing of science and technology that kind of sets the stage for the subtitle of the book, where his commitment to science and technology helped modernize America, really put us on a path that expanded the federal government. I mean, that was one thing, but brought science into the government, brought science into what we were doing. And that's what I carry throughout it. So it's kind of like, what did he learn? How did he apply it? And then how did that help both win the war and set us on the stage for the future?
Yeah, so this massive impact that he has through his commitment to science. And where does this commitment to science come from? Obviously, many of us are familiar with Lincoln's story. He comes from, as you mentioned, a hard background, hard scrabble kind of life. Father wants him to follow in the footsteps, but he's an intellectual. So where does this love for science come, and how does he cultivate it as a young man?
That's part of the interesting thing about Lincoln, is that he grew up on subsistence farms. His father had no further ambition than to be able to, run a farm and raise his family and provide for his family, and that was it. And that was very common on the frontier. That's why you were out on the frontier. You were building a life out of the woods, and so Lincoln didn't have much advantage from that respect. And his father, he wrote that his father was pretty much illiterate and could bunglily write his own name, and that's it. He couldn't really write or read. His mother really couldn't write, but she could read a little, mainly the Bible to him. And then after she died, his stepmother was a little bit more literate. She could read and she could write a little, but she had a library. She had books. By library, I mean like 6 books, you know.
Not like your collection.
Yeah, I mean, I have that much on my desk, but but he started reading books. So he's out there and he's working as a farmer, and he grows very quickly. He's bigger than and stronger than most of people his age. And when they move from Kentucky to Indiana when he's 7 years old, he says he was, given an axe, and for the next 20 years, he almost never put down this most useful instrument. He basically was out there, he was tilling fields and farming and cutting down trees and everything else. But he was also different from a lot of people in that was all that farming work, that was fine for people like his father and most of his peers. But for him, he was just intellectually stimulated from the beginning. He wanted to learn things. And as he grew older and learned more, he realized, I don't want to do all of this farming stuff. It's hard work and, there's no future in it. I want to learn, and I want to learn things and go on and do bigger and better things, whatever that might be. So he did pick up books and read. So I talk about in the book, I have a whole chapter on his education. And when he writes, handwrites an autobiography and gives it off to a journalist to write expanded biographies for when he's running for president, he says that there's nothing about his life growing up that there is to write about. That he had very little education. That over his entire life growing up, he had no more than 1 year of formal education. And that was not all at once. It was a few weeks here, a couple of months there, spread over basically 14, 15 years. So he didn't learn much other than reading, writing, and ciphering to the rule of 3. So I looked at that, and I look at some of the things later, like he writes what's called a fragment, writes out this piece about my Niagara Falls after visiting. And I read that and I see there's a lot of science that he knows in there. Where did he get that? He didn't get that from less than a year of reading, writing, and ciphering to the rule of 3. Mm-hmm. So that's part of the reason why I started digging into it. And I did find that like even on the farm, he had to learn some forest ecology, because he had to go out there and cut down trees. He says that, when he moved to Indiana, it was a very dense forest with a lot of wild animals. And they had to cut the forest down to clear enough land to plant crops. So unlike today, where it's second growth forest or third growth forest, where there's not that many species of trees, back then there were hundreds of different kinds of trees. So every kind of tree has a different ecology. Some of them are good for building the log cabin. Some of them are good for cooking, burning in the fire. Some of them are small, so you could cut them with an axe. Some of them are huge, and cutting them with an axe is pretty difficult. So we had to learn how they worked, how the nutrients get from the roots up to the top. And that led to girdling, where you could cut off the bark all the way around so that the nutrients can't get up into the tree, and eventually the tree dies. So he learned a lot about ecology that way. He learned a lot about hydrology, how water flows, by seeing it rain, for example, on the fields, or raining on the hills around the fields, and nothing really on the fields, and then the rain rushing down in a flood and washing away all the topsoil. And he learned about hydrology and how just one bad storm can just wipe away your whole livelihood. Mm-hmm. So he did learn things like that. He also, because of the lack of schooling, he did a lot of self-studying. And this was part of his philosophy that he developed in life, of bettering his condition, of learning on his own what he couldn't learn through school and he couldn't learn from his parents. And he did that through reading. And he did that through practicing over and over and over. So one of the things as far as the science and mathematics, especially, that he learned, the idea of the ciphering to the rule of three, well, that doesn't sound like much. He knows how to add, subtract, and do multiplication and maybe division. And ciphering to the rule of three is what we would call a ratio today, a proportion. So three numbers, and you have to figure out how to get to the fourth number. Things like, if it costs $2 for a bushel of corn, how much does it cost for half a bushel of corn? Mm-hmm. That sort of thing. But he also learned by studying himself. He learned a lot more math. He had to learn much more complicated division. Some stuff that would make people cry today, when they go through all these divisions. And you can see that William Herndon, his last law partner, after the assassination, he went out and talked to all the people that had known him in Indiana and in New Salem before Herndon had met him. And his stepmother gave Herndon about a dozen sheets from what used to be 100-sheet sum book or copybook. And this is where he would practice his math. And just looking at the 12, that he learned a lot more math than he let on. Mm-hmm. It wasn't just the rule of three, it was double rule of three and reverse rule of three. And it was long division and very complicated things like discounts and interest rates and a lot of things that people today wouldn't have even heard of. He learned all of that stuff. Plus, later in his life, a little bit after New Salem, or when he was in New Salem, he became a surveyor. So to plot out the land for roads and towns, things like that. Well, to be a surveyor, you have to learn trigonometry and geometry. And he got books on surveying, and he went through them. And I went through these same books that he used. There's some pretty interesting math in there. Trigonometry is looking at the angles, like sines and cosines and tangents of angles and, things that people hate to do today. Yeah, he was learning those. He was learning those on his own.
Right.
So, and even later when he became a congressman, his one term in the U.S. Congress, he got there and he realized that most of these congressmen, especially from the East, were much better educated and they knew things more. So he learned that one of the things that they studied was Euclid geometry. Euclid was this ancient mathematician that had come up with this mechanism for this method for geometry, and which is shapes, study of shapes, and it's also a study in logic. Thomas Jefferson had read it later in his life to help his logical skills, and Lincoln did it to improve his logical thinking. Mm-hmm. So he was learning all of this math. He was learning all of the science on the way. He also, when he was a lawyer and partnering with William Herndon, Herndon was kind of a compulsive book collector. Not that I can understand anything like that, he collected a lot of books. He had a pretty large library. Lincoln really didn't have much of a library, but he used Herndon's stuff. And Herndon was into science. So he would buy things. And as soon as Darwin's book was available, he got Origin of Species, which was kind of late for Lincoln to look at it. But he got all the science books, and he got this Annual of Science, which came out every year and just kind of summarized all the science that had come out that year. Mm-hmm. And Lincoln got and looked at this and said, "Oh man, this is great." And he went through it and he said, "This comes out every year and it's been coming out for like the last 20 years. You have to go out and get all the back issues, get a subscription so we get the next one." He really did get into that science. So he was studying all of this stuff on his own. And I guess I'll add one more thing. When he was out on the circuit as a lawyer, he and the other lawyers and a judge would just ride around on horseback and in carriages, and then later on railroads. And they would go around this huge area, the center of Illinois, to go to each of the county seats in each county in the 8th Judicial Circuit, and they would take whatever trials were been waiting there for them to take on. And of course, I spend a lot of time on horseback going through people's farms and along the way. And whenever he saw something new and mechanical in a field, he would say, wait, I have to go look at that. And he'd get the farmer to explain it to him. So there was a time period when there was a lot of new inventions coming out, new things to make farming easier. There were things for planting. There was things for the reapers that would help you collect the wheat and corn. And he was very much interested in all of that. So he was building his technological expertise as well, doing that. And all of this was pretty much on his own. He was studying on his own and learning all this stuff, whereas most people were not bothering to do that. But he saw the importance of it early on, both from his own personal learning and growth, and how this could help society by implementing these ways to do things easier. Because he'd grown up on the farm, he hated it. He saw that, but he knew farming was still, most people were still farmers in the country, North and South. And he understood that farming was going to be critical for the rest of forever. And even today, even though farms are much different, it's still critical, obviously, to providing the food.
Right.
And he knew that there were better ways to do it. So that was kind of in his thinking all along. How does this thing get better? It gets better from using technology to make it easier, so you can get better yields, but also science, so that you don't deplete the soil and maybe crop rotation, things like that, in order to also improve the yields. So all of those things kind of fit into his thinking when he then became a politician, and also in his legal career, and then the Civil War itself.
So it sounds like this hardscrabble background, as much as he hated it, does help him because he gets that hands-on science experience, and he's also taking in as much knowledge as he can, which is a really good lesson we could all take from Lincoln. So you kind of touched on it. As he's a lawyer, he's on the circuit, he's seeing inventions firsthand, and he's learning about them. So when he becomes a lawyer and he becomes a representative in Congress and in the Illinois legislature, how does he advocate for science, and how does he continue to grow his knowledge? Obviously, you mentioned Euclid and studying that. Is there anything else that he does to continue to expand his knowledge as he's a young professional?
Yeah, he's a lifelong learner, so he's constantly learning all the way through the Civil War, borrowing books from the Library of Congress on science and on military strategy. So he's constantly learning. And that's certainly a lesson that we could learn from him. But when he became a politician, he was in the Illinois state legislature for 4 terms, so a total of 8 years. And it was a period of time when there was a big push towards something called internal improvements. And internal improvements are what today we would call it infrastructure projects. But back then, they were focused on 4 different things that were trying to using technology to improve transportation and the economy. So the 4 things that they were trying to improve were roads. Up until then, Lincoln, whenever they moved, from one farm to another, and when they moved from Kentucky to Indiana and Indiana to Illinois, they spent a lot of time stuck in the mud. The roads basically were wherever you could get a horse or a wagon through the forest. People would start following it, and eventually it'd be tamped down, and there wasn't really a road there. It's just worn down from usage. And when it rained, it would turn to mud, which would go all the way up to like the axles of these carriages that they were in wagons. So you really couldn't move, and you would literally get stuck, and you couldn't go anywhere. And then during the winter, it would all freeze, and you would just have these ruts and horse prints through, and it would be very difficult to get through there too. So one of the things he pushed for was getting roads built. Now they weren't like I-95 or anything like that. They were simple, like getting some drainage so they didn't turn to mud, some packed rock and packed dirt, maybe leveling them so that they're easier to go on. And, eventually it was years later when they finally started getting things like macadam and, start pavement, but that was the beginning of it. Another was, at the time, the rivers were really the main form of transportation and commerce. Big rivers like the Ohio and the Mississippi obviously were used to get farm goods down especially to New Orleans, where there was a huge trading area and a big city. And Lincoln had taken himself two flatboat trips, one from Indiana and one from Illinois, down through the big rivers and to New Orleans. In one of those trips, the second one, he gets stuck on the mill dam outside of New Salem. And that getting his flatboat stuck was part of the reason why he ended up with a patent later on. But it was also part of the reason why he pushed for getting the rivers dredged and cleared out to make them more navigable.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, by this time, he's living in New Salem. The Sangamon River, where he got stuck, is pretty important to the town. And in fact, later on, after it kind of meanders away from the town folds and it just disappears. But he wanted, okay, let's get these smaller rivers cleared away get the brush cleared away from the edges, and let's see if we can dig them out a little bit, so steamboats can go up, because steamboats were expanding at that time. And he saw that huge technological advance as being, wow, this could really help both move people around, but move goods around. Mm-hmm. And these farmers can sell their goods for much further distance. So he was really pushing for that. The third aspect was canals. So canals in a lot of places could, cut through some of these meanders. A lot of these smaller rivers kind of curved around, and they took a long time to get a short distance. But if you put in canals, it could like connect the dots, so that you could make it easier. And he saw himself as the DeWitt Clinton of Illinois. And for people who don't know who DeWitt Clinton is, which is most people, he was the governor of New York when the Erie Canal was completed. And prior to that, he had actually been instrumental in getting the Erie Canal approved and start getting it built. So the Erie Canal, which goes from just above Albany on the Hudson River, straight across upper New York State to the Lake Erie, mm-hmm. really opened up commerce for New England and New York and Pennsylvania even, to get into the Great Lakes. And once you're in the Great Lakes, you could take steamships around the Great Lakes. And Lincoln saw especially the Illinois and Michigan Canal, which ran from Chicago, kind of southwest down until it meets the Illinois River, and the Illinois River eventually reaches the Mississippi River. And he said, well, that will just connect everything. All these people in New England and New York, they could get through the Erie Canal into the Great Lakes, into the Illinois and Michigan Canal, and down the river. It would be great for the economy of Illinois. Mm-hmm. And I'll before I go to the fourth one, I'll stop and add, if you picture Illinois at that time, picture it now, it's kind of in the middle of the country. Mm-hmm. But at that time, there wasn't a whole lot west of Illinois that had been states yet. There were a couple of states, but most of it was still territory. And in fact, when he was doing this, the furthest west part hadn't even become part of the United States yet. It was still part of Mexico. So Illinois really was the crossroads between the established states and places where everybody wanted to go to build. And he saw that and he said, hey, you know, we're right in the middle here. We can really maximize this economically.
Right.
So it's great for transportation, moving people around. It's great for our economy. So, and that was part of the driver. So the fourth part of this internal improvements were railroads. And the railroads were growing. They had already existed in the East for a little bit, just like steamboats, but they were slowly working their way westward. And he saw them as advantageous, both because they were faster and they can go on land and they can go to places that the rivers you couldn't get to on rivers, but also the rivers mostly were useful going north to south. The Ohio and the Mississippi and all the big rivers, you know, you take it and you go south and you get to New Orleans and then you sell all your stuff. Railroads could just go straight from the east where everybody was. They'd go west. And that would be helpful for transport and the economy. And it would be good for the United States to do that, in addition to being good for Illinois. So he worked very hard to push those improvements, that infrastructure improvements. So that was probably the biggest thing he did when he was in the Illinois state legislature. And then even when he went to Congress, he continued to push internal improvements both in Illinois and elsewhere. Even as president, he pushed that. There were several acts that were passed and he signed that helped westward expansion in particular. But we can talk about that again later. So that was a lot of what he did when he was as a politician. But he was also a lawyer. Because politician was like kind of a part-time thing. You know, he only worked so many months as a state legislator, and he still had to have his day job as a lawyer. And even when he was in Congress, people today look at Congress and say, well, you know, these people, they don't work very much. You know, they take all this time off, and like this month in August that we're talking, this is a recess month, and most of the congressmen are back home, getting a much needed vacation, but also meeting up with constituents and doing some campaigning because we have an election coming up especially for people in the House of Representatives.
Right.
So at Lincoln's time, they had the 2-year term for the House, just like they do now. And they had 2 sessions, so one in each year. And the sessions were only about 3 months. So in between those sessions, he would go back to Illinois and he'd be a lawyer. And by that time, he was a lawyer that was getting pretty well known for being able to handle complicated patent cases and technological cases. Before that, early on, he was doing a lot of things like collecting debts and divorces and the bread and butter stuff that most lawyers, especially out on the frontier, which Illinois still was. So most of his trials, when you look at all of the trials that he was involved in, his cases, most of them were debt cases. They were nothing really exciting. But the later cases, he did much more in a way of patent cases, technological cases, railroad cases, all more and more that were technologically related or science related, some medical malpractice cases.
Mm-hmm.
And he became known for somebody who could handle those sorts of things and understand them. And there are a couple of cases that really kind of epitomize that. If you have time, I can talk about those.
Yeah, I would love to hear about them.
Okay, so there's a couple of cases that become very important. One is a case he didn't actually try, but he prepared for it. So you probably heard about this. That is popularly called the Manny McCormick Reaper trial. And this is a reapers are farm machinery that you would usually pull behind a horse that would help collect, reap the wheat and the corn, so that it would be easier than trying to cut it and pull it by hand. Cut it with a hand scythe. This would mechanize that, and it made it much easier, and you could plant more acreage. So McCormick is very famous. His father had invented a reaper, and then his son had improved on it, and he had a patent on it. He had several patents on it, and everybody wanted to copy it. So a guy by the name of Manny made something that was similar, and he got sued by McCormick. So the trial was going to happen, and McCormick was in Illinois, as was Manny. So the trial was going to be in Chicago. So the trial lawyers, who were actually in Ohio, hired Lincoln. They, oh, this guy's a patent lawyer. He knows his stuff. He knows the people in Illinois. Let's get him on. And Lincoln was, I love this. This is my kind of case. So he goes up and he looks at Manny's equipment, and he really pulls it apart and really understands it. He looks at McCormick's equipment. He brings in a couple of guys that know about the two different kinds and interviews them. He prepares this brief. And all during this time, the lawyers that hired him neglected to tell him that the case had been moved to Cincinnati. And since it was in Cincinnati, they didn't really need an Illinois lawyer anymore. They had this guy by the name of Edwin Stanton as a lawyer. And you might recognize Edwin Stanton's name, who becomes Secretary of War in Civil War. So Stanton didn't really like Lincoln, and he was kind of a headstrong kind of guy, as we all know from the Civil War. So he doesn't want to have anything to do with Lincoln, but Lincoln didn't know this yet. So he shows up in Cincinnati, and he gets dissed by the lawyers and by Stanton, and he's not allowed to participate in the trial. So he's pretty angry at this, but he does stay there, and he watches the trial from the back. And he picks up some trial tips, how these Eastern lawyers, do trials. So he does learn some stuff, but he kind of vows that maybe I'm not going to ever come back to Cincinnati. I didn't get treated very well. But in the end, the trial, it finishes, it goes on and gets appealed, and eventually ends up in the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court rules for Manny, who was the side that Lincoln was working on, was the Manny side. And at the end of the appeals, it ends up in Manny's favor, largely on the basis for this technical brief that Lincoln had written, but never got a chance to present. So it shows he didn't, even though he didn't really try the case, it shows how he understood mechanical and technological aspects of these issues, which became very important in other cases. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of different cases. I talk about many cases in both technical patent cases. He did a lot of patent cases and railroad cases. But there's another one that's pretty interesting that really made a difference to the whole country. And that's usually called the Effie Afton trial. Effie Afton was the name of a steamboat. And up to this time, steamboats, like I said, had most of the commerce going up and down the Mississippi River. And St. Louis was the hub. And this steamboat that came out of St. Louis and goes north as far as you can go, which is pretty far north on the Mississippi. They get to just above an area in Illinois called Rock Island. And Rock Island is like an island in the middle of the Mississippi, and the Mississippi is much more narrow at this point than it is down when you think of how wide it is down in New Orleans. It's much more narrow, and you could cross it with bridges. A short bridge from Illinois to the island, and then a slightly longer bridge from the island to Iowa. It's now Iowa. So the railroads built a bridge to get across so they could run a railroad across the Mississippi River, the very first railroad bridge in the country across the Mississippi River. And there were other railroad bridges across other rivers, but the first one across the Mississippi River. And that the steamboat companies didn't like this idea because it might, if the railroads got established and kept going west, they might steal business.
Right.
So this Effie Afton steamboat, it stops and picks on fuel, which was wood for the fire boilers at the time. And then it proceeds a short distance upstream to go under this bridge, which had only been there for a couple of weeks. It promptly runs into the bridge, catches fire, burns the steamboat down to the water line. Luckily, nobody died, even though there was a lot of people on board, but it lost a lot of money. There was a lot of product on there. And it burned up part of the bridge and made the bridge unusable for a while, at least. And then the steamboat company sued the railroad company. And by this time, Lincoln was working for the railroads. And so the railroad called in Lincoln. And Lincoln spent a lot of time studying the area, studying the reach. He got out there on the water. He hired an engineer to help him work through this. And then in the trial, he explained to the jury in a very technologically complicated closing argument, which luckily we have almost a verbatim transcript of, which was not common. And he explained how a steamboat going through this area could not possibly have hit one side of the bridge, and then while it's moving at 5 or 6 knots an hour forward, suddenly move and go all the way to the other side and hit the other side of the bridge without moving forward at all. And he explained, like, I think it was either negligence or intentional.
Mm-hmm.
And so he explains it very technically, and then he summarizes it in popular language that people can understand, which was something he was known for, how to convince a jury of very technical aspects of things. And the jury ended up as a hung jury. But he had managed to convince 8 of these 12 people that it was the steamboat's fault that did this. And the other 4 were not so sure. So, but it ended in the hung jury, and it got retried, and that didn't end up working anywhere. It didn't matter. In the end, it basically got dropped, and Lincoln was able to convince enough people so that it delayed everything. And meanwhile, the railroad just rebuilt the bridge and was running trains over. And it was like, this was the first time that trains could now get across to the western side of the Mississippi River.
Mm-hmm.
And this really, really started the switch from a focus on steamships going up and down these rivers to the south, to trains going just total straight west. And so eventually the Transcontinental Railroad would go all the way west.
So Lincoln was at the center of this?
Lincoln was at the center of this, yeah. And then because I said he worked for the railroads, he was on retainer by the Illinois Central Railroad for a long time. And he did have cases against them later, but he worked for them for a long time. He did a lot of small cases. He set a lot of precedents, both for the Illinois Central and for other railroads, both that protected the railroad and set up some precedents for corporate, interest, laws that help the corporations. But he also did the opposite. He set some precedents in his trials to protect workers that had been injured, that were forced the corporations to start providing safe working conditions for their workers. So he set precedents going both directions. Mm-hmm. on that. And of course, all of this that he's learning, all this technological stuff, all of the way the river works, all the way the railroads, all of this is something that helped him think through strategy in the Civil War.
Yeah, and so it sounds like he develops this early on, this interest in science. He realizes the importance of it, and then he really starts to implement it as he becomes a lawyer, as he becomes a politician. And then obviously he goes to the White House, right? That's not the end of his
Mhm.
career there. So let's talk a bit about his expansion of technology in the White House. During the Civil War, especially, it's a great time of technological advancement. So how does he progress it, and what's his role during his time as president?
Yeah, I talk a lot about what happened during the Civil War, and people have referred to the Civil War as the first modern war because of the technological advances. Of course, people also referred to the Revolutionary War as the first modern war because of the technological advances. You get the Minutemen are, not standing up there in a row with red jackets, just like making themselves sitting ducks to get shot, so there
Right.
was technological advance because of the way that they were able to do that. So every war is the first modern war up to that point. But the Civil War really hit kind of a sweet spot, I think, in moving strategy wise from a very simple weapons to more complicated weapons. And
Mhm.
some of those got used during the war. Some of them were developed but didn't really get used until later. Um, but So there was that. And then the fact that telegraph and trains and other advancements were now available for use in war became very important.
Mhm.
So for as far as Lincoln goes, and let's just look at the technology to begin with. So he was very interested in every aspect of technology. He was somebody that had a reputation and got quickly an expanded reputation as being a guy who would listen to inventors. So people would back then you could get into the White House, you just walk up to the front door and say, "I'm here to see the president." And if there were other people there, and usually there was a line and people waiting and outside, waiting down the stairways to get up to the second floor to talk to the president. And he would let them in one at a time and he would just talk to them. And some of these guys, they're carrying these big rifles, and so I've got a new rifle, I want to show you. Of course, you wouldn't get past the fence now. You'd be tackled by the Secret Service, but they
Right.
didn't have that then yet. So he was very interested in seeing what kinds of new inventions. We didn't have a military industrial complex like we have now. We didn't have defense contractors. Basically relied on individual inventors to come up with new ideas. So there were people that brought in things that were improvements on rifling guns. And he was very much into this idea of moving towards more advanced individual guns, rifles. So at the beginning of the war, most people were using smoothbore muskets. So one shot, a ball that goes, wherever it goes, and not that accurate for very far. And then as soon as you shoot it, you had to stand up and go through this whole procedure to put in the powder, put in the bullet, put in, tamp everything down, get it all set. If you're really, really, really good, you could get 3 shots off in a minute. Plus, you have to stand up to do this to get the ball in there. It's hard to do when you're laying on your stomach. So, you make yourself an easy victim.
Mhm.
Then they went and he pushed the idea, and he had people come in and he tested some of these things to get rifled muskets. And the rifle is just, just the groove inside that spirals, that now you have a conical shell and you could spin it and it's much more accurate for a much further distance. So he tested some of those himself. The most famous is probably the totally forgot the name of it. Spencer. Sorry, the Spencer breech loading rifle. So here is now you can load the bullets from the breech, and you, instead of having to put it into the barrel, it's rifled. It's a little shorter. And you have a cartridge where you can stick into the stock that has 7 bullets in it. And you could fire those 7 bullets and then reload it with another cartridge. And instead of maybe 3 shots, you can get dozens, if you're really good. Well, there's an advantage to that. And Lincoln saw that advantage. He tested it. He was a pretty good shot, but he tested it, and then he had to convince the ordnance officer Ripley to put these into service. And Ripley was like, "I don't want those things." And Ripley has a point. If you could shoot off 7 bullets in a short period of time, and you're scared and you're green, and most of these new recruits, they had been farmers a week before. They weren't really trained soldiers when they started, especially early in the war. They're going to get scared. They're either going to drop it and leave this new weapon for the other side, or they're just going to shoot everything and not hit anything. Right. So there was this battle between Lincoln and the ordnance people who just wanted, give me a lot of something simple. And Lincoln was like, "I want to get you stuff that would do the job better." So he did that. He also got involved in bigger weapons, like there's something he called a coffee mill gun that because it had like a hopper on the top where you put in the coffee grounds and then grind it. And then, this basically, you throw in the bullets and then you would grind it with a crank, and it would shoot them in turn out one barrel. And then he tested that, and he was in on it. And he also looked at an improvement to that by another guy, and eventually the Gatling gun, which had a rotating barrel with multiple barrels that you crank it and it fires a lot. So he did a lot of things like that. But he also did things like you think of the monitor, the ironclad monitor. That almost didn't happen. Soon after the war started, when Virginia had left the Union, the United States had the Gosport Navy Yard in Norfolk. And they were like, "Oh, well, Virginia's leaving. We can't let them have all of this equipment." So they just tried to scuttle everything and burn it down. So they burned down one of the ships. They burned down was the Merrimack. It's a big wooden sailing ship. Only as wood burns, it sinks, and basically the hull was okay under the water. So the Confederates got this ship, and they raised the hull, and they put ironclad sheets on it to make an ironclad, the CSS Virginia. But even though everybody still called it the Merrimack, it was the CSS Virginia. And they went down the Hampton Roads in the following year, and they were just totally destroying these wooden boats, wooden sailing ships. In the meantime, you couldn't keep any secrets back then. So the Union knew that they were building the Virginia, so they said, "We need one." They actually put an advertisement in the newspaper, said, "We need designs for ironclads. Anybody have one?" And one of the people that came forward was a guy by the name of John Ericsson. He was a Swedish inventor that had already pretty much designed what was the Monitor, which was, I'm sure everybody has seen it. It looked like a cheese box on a raft. It was called. It's basically just a flat raft-looking thing with a round turret on the top. So it was a little different than the Confederate version. But he had that, and he had a model on his shelf. He had tried to sell the idea to Napoleon III, and Napoleon was like, "Yeah, we already have some. We don't need it." It was sitting there and ready on pretty much the design, ready to be built. But he had such a falling out with the Navy a decade or so before because of an incident that almost killed the Vice President of the United States. It did kill the Secretary of State, that they blamed on Ericsson. Navy blamed on Ericsson. He said, "I don't want to have anything to do with you people." And it was Lincoln. It was a meeting with Lincoln where Lincoln looked at the model, talked to Erickson and the Navy and basically said, I think there's something in this. It's like, you got to get over your feud and make this happen. And he made sure that there was money and materials to make the Monitor, which gets down to Hampton Roads just in time to fight it out with the CSS Virginia and come to a stalemate. And neither one of them actually fought again after that. They eventually both won. The Confederates scuttled theirs, and the Monitor ended up, they were moving it to another place, and it sunk. I will say one thing though. Lincoln actually had something to do with the CSS Virginia, the Merrimack ironclad, getting scuttled. He went down with Chase and some of the other people from the cabinet down the Hampton Roads. This was months later. And he toured the Monitor, which had been, refurbished after getting some damage. And he said, we want to take back the Norfolk Naval Yard, the Gosport, what had been the Gosport Naval Yard, Norfolk. We need to go after you guys. What are you doing? Let's go for it. And he pushed the people to go and take it over, which they were able to do because the Confederates just said, we don't want to have anything to do with this. And they left. So they took it over. But part of this, he went on shore to look on the Confederately held side to say, how do we, where do we land? He's pushing these people. Let's find a place to land. And then he said, I want you to start firing at some of these targets, these Confederate targets, and just start firing at them from the Monitor and from other wooden ships that were in the area. Just start firing on it. The Confederates on the Virginia, the Merrimack, they were sitting there off Carney Island thinking, what's all this firing going on here? I hear all this this artillery. We better get it going. So he's like, let's try to go upriver. He said, well, we can't because we're too low. So they start offloading all the stuff to make them lighter. And then they can't get to the point where they're light enough to get upriver, but they do get to the point where they're too light to go the other direction and go out to sea. So now they're like, well, we're stuck. And everybody gets off and they set fire to it to destroy it. All because Lincoln was like, they're pushing his own generals to say, do something, So Lincoln also did in the technology side, he really pushed to use the railroads. He became a very hands-on, his own general-in-chief, basically, by using a telegraph, which now for the first time can be used in warfare. It had never been used in warfare like this before. And he's sending messages back and forth. So he's playing much more hands-on. So he did a lot to push the technological side. And there's much more that I talk about, but he did a lot to push the technological side. And then I guess I'll say really quickly on the science side, there were issues that were created by the war, like you have these new ironclad ships clad with iron, and the compasses that all ships have to figure out where they're going, they're like spinning around because the iron is all over every place. And they go, how do we deal with that? So he pushes the new National Academy of Sciences to work on that. He dealt with issues related to coal. He dealt with issues related to saltpeter, the niter that's used in gunpowder. So he worked with his science people to do all of that. So I'll stop there.
So Lincoln obviously is this great intellectual mind. He's a great politician, but he's also forward thinking. He's all for technology. And it sounds like you mentioned the use of railroads. He really wants to use the Norse industrial capacity to put down this rebellion.
Yes, he knew, and he realized early on, and it was pretty much common knowledge early on, that the North had a lot more railroads had a lot more telegraph lines, had a lot more manufacturing capacity, had a lot more ironworks capacity, and that those could be used to the North's advantage. The South had disdained all of those things because they thought, for one thing, they thought that, well, if you have more railroads, that gives more opportunity for enslaved people to escape. We don't want that. We don't want communication because with a telegraph, because the more people can talk to each other, the more they realize that maybe there's a better way than the way we're doing things.
Right.
It's typical. You see that now, where people are trying to control communication, trying to you make sure that people aren't educated. Make sure that you restrict how much power they have. And the North was the exact opposite. Lincoln was very much a proponent of education, of technological and scientific advantages, of using all of this to help not just the rich people, like somebody like Thomas Jefferson. He did some inventing and did some things when he was around, but it was mainly to make his life easier and to increase his wealth. Lincoln saw this as a mechanism to allow individuals better opportunities. Like the government could be used to lift the weights off of the soldiers, the shoulders of the citizens, so that they then had this equal opportunity to advance, so that even the poorest farmer or worker could advance and have their own business someday and become rich their own way. That took education, that took being open to advancement.
Well, I don't want to give away too much of your book because I want our listeners to pick it up. Obviously, this book comes out next month, correct? When can listeners pick it up, or maybe it's available for pre-order now?
Yeah, you can pre-order it now at all the usual places. So all the online places like Amazon and Barnes and Noble and your independent stores. I'm going to be on the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop on September 1st, the day the book comes out. You can get it from pre-order from them, and it's supposed to be also in Walmart and Target and everywhere else. So you can pre-order it now, and it comes out on September 1st.
Very cool. Is there a way that listeners can reach out to you if they have questions, or social media perhaps they could follow you on?
Yeah, I can. I can send you my information and you can attach it, I guess. But basically, if you go to my website at davidjkent-writer.com, that's my website. And you can find my email address there as well, which is similar. And that way you can reach out to me. I also have a Facebook page. So you can look for David J. Kent on Facebook and find my author Facebook page, and I have Instagram and all those different things. So David J. Kent Wright on Instagram and Twitter.
I'll make sure to put that in the notes for everybody. Is there anything you'd like to leave us with as we kind of wrap up our discussion here?
No, I'll just say that, and I just sort of said this a few minutes ago, but Lincoln's vision was not just what was mainly that we should all spend our whole lives learning as much as we possibly can. That education was the most important thing that we could do. That we should always be looking for opportunities, and that we all do better when we all do better. Mm-hmm. It's really important to keep moving forward and to always be looking for opportunities, and that the government has a role in providing either providing opportunities or removing burdens so that those opportunities are more easily attainable. So I think that's Lincoln's main thinking that drove both his personal growth and the growth of the country.
Yeah, that's fantastic. As an educator myself, lifelong learning is what we try to instill in people. It's so valuable. And for the listeners, I encourage you to pick up this book if you enjoyed the discussion, and you can learn more about Lincoln and his commitment to technology and science. And I'll make sure to put a link in there for anyone who wants to pick up this book so they can support you. Well, thank you very much. This has been a great conversation and a fascinating topic to discuss.
Great. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us for this discussion with David J. Kent. I hope you learned something about Lincoln and his scientific advancements. I also hope you'll join us next week as we sit down with Darren Rawlings to discuss the war from the UK perspective. Please leave a review as always, share, and head to thecivilwarcenter.com for more, and consider picking up Lincoln, the Fire of Genius. See you next week.